In a recent video, Magnus Mitbo asked Janja Garnbret and her coach Roman how they thought she would do against the men in competition.
In lead, I would even bet for that she could even win.
I mean, like Roman said, I think in lead I could do like pretty well.
Yeah.
Because I did try some of the men's routes and I did pretty well, but a comp is a comp.
Now, when it comes to comps, or anything else climbing for that matter, it's hard to doubt Janja. She's the most successful competition climber in history by a wide margin. And like she says, she's tried some of the routes, so it's pretty likely that yes, she could do well, maybe even win in any given sport climbing competition. But of course, there are the naysayers. This is the internet after all, and anybody can comment, even the ignorant. But the thing is, there's already a precedent for women performing on a comp route better than many of the best men. A precedent that was set back in the early days of indoor competition climbing by a woman you've probably heard of, Lynn Hill. Of course it was Lynn Hill. It goes, boys. And in my research for this episode, I sorted out some confusion in the record and came up with an exciting realization that I'll tell you about at the end of this video. Now, we all know Lynn for her first free ascent and then one-day free ascent of the nose on El Cap. Or you might know her as the first woman to climb 514, after one of the strongest male climbers in the world claimed that no woman would ever climb 514. And I tell both of those stories in my podcast and in my recent book, Written in Stone, the 1990s. Links for those are in the description. But what might be less well known is that she was the first American queen of competition climbing. In 1986, at the Grand Prix d'Escalade in Trouba, France, Lynn became the first American climber to win an international climbing competition. The next year, she won several events. Eventually, she'd win 30 times in international events, including 5 times at the prestigious Arco Rockmaster. In those early years, she dominated. And by the fall of 1990, Lynn had become a star, but she was tiring of the competition life and yearning for something different, a return to her roots. And seeing this, the media had started to hype up the rivalry between Lynn and a young French climber, Isabelle Paticier. And she'd beaten Lynn to the first 13D climbed by a woman, and then Lynn had upped the ante with 14A. And in the competition scene, it wasn't much different. The two consistently traded wins. And to some, they seemed like opposites. While Lynn had recently appeared in a perfume ad, Paticier was a bona fide pinup girl, a role she didn't shy away from at all. She was the young, new face of climbing, while Hill was often the oldest competitor. And she climbed with the same effortless flow as fellow French climbers Patrick Etlanger and Francois Legrand. While Lynn, 6 inches shorter, often needed to be much more powerful and dynamic to make the same reaches on the artificial walls. According to Robin Rabitou, then Urbisfield, who was handed the Comp Queen torch by Lynn Hill, "When you watch Isabelle, it just looks too easy. She simply graces her way up the wall. Lynn battles, but she almost never falls. She has this tenacity." In a 1991 issue of Rotpunk magazine, Tillman Hepp wrote, "Superlatives are hardly out of place when it comes to Lynn's climbing skills. Not only does she dominate the women's competition and is the only woman to have conquered an 8B+ route, which corresponds to a route in the upper 10th grade, but also because hardly anyone would doubt it. She could easily hold her own among the world's best male climbers. Lynn Hill, as the male climbers readily admit, has the skill to advance to any men's final. What leads her to demand equal routes for women and men is the inescapable desire to push herself to the limit, to achieve the highest possible performance. It's like," she explains to me, "as if I had to abandon a route just below the summit and wasn't allowed to participate in the final ascent, simply because I'm a woman. Why shouldn't everyone try, regardless of gender? For me, it's about the ultimate limit." And just like today, I'm sure there were doubters, but also maybe not so many, because just a few months earlier, in November of 1990, Lynn had already proven her point. Lyon, France was one of the final stops on the brand new World Cup circuit, which in 1990 was only in its second year, and Lyon was the hometown of Isabelle Paticier, so the locals had high expectations for their superstar. The comp didn't exactly start off with a bang. The qualifying rounds were held in a different building in another town. The men's route only had room for 50 spectators and literally took the entire day. The final competitor, UK climber Mark Leach, finally left ISO a little after midnight after over 12 hours waiting. And the next day, the women had to compete on a giant roof, even though the only wall to warm up on in ISO was a small slab. But the expected names made it through. Semifinals and finals were held in the much bigger Lyon Sports Palace, and over the weekend, 7,000 people would pay to watch their hometown heroine. When the smoke cleared from semis, the list of finalists was a who's who of the best climbers of the time. For the men, Ben Moon, Simon Naden, Robert Cortijo, Didier Rabitou, Francois Legrand, Yuji Hirayama, Jibe Tribu, and, well, 8 other people who were tied for 5th place. A little side note here, back then, climbers didn't score by reaching holds that had a point value. Instead, vertical distance was measured, and you can see those distance measurements in the results here. But I use measured lightly. It was just eyeballed by judges who would be hanging along the route. And if 2 competitors seemed to have tied, judges would pull out their measuring stick and measure to the spot they had eyeballed, but still, not exactly precise. And in fact, in the case of a really difficult move, it was often better to not even try to do the move, but to just jump as high as possible and pat the wall with a chalked hand, a tactic used regularly back then. So it seems like a tie would be rare, but they happen pretty often. For the women, the results were more reasonable and pretty much as expected. Louisa Giovanni, Susie Good, Robin Erbisfield, and of course, Lynn Hill and Isabelle Paticier. And Isabelle was riding high off of a win at the recent World Cup stop in Nuremberg, while Lynn was coming in with something to prove. In Nuremberg, she stepped onto the first foothold of the first route in qualifiers, and her foot slipped off and landed back on the ground, ending her competition literally before it had started. But back to the Lyon Sports Palace. In finals, the hometown crowd went wild as Isabelle and Lynn tied, forcing a superfinal. Now, what happened in the case of a superfinal seems to have varied comp to comp. Sometimes they altered the women's final route to make it harder. Sometimes the women competed on an altered version of the men's finals route. In this case, though, according to 2 magazine articles about the event, the men's finals route was left unchanged and would be used for the superfinal between Lynn Hill and Isabelle Paticier. The crowd had already seen the men climb the finals route, so they knew how hard it was. And only 2 men had finished it, Didier Rabitou and Francois Legrand, forcing a superfinal of their own, which Didier ultimately won. They'd also seen that on the finals route, Didier had struggled with some massive reaches, and though he was short for a male competitor, he still had 4 or 5 inches on Lynn. Now, the way Lynn told it to me, she walked back into ISO and saw Isabelle talking with Francois Legrand about the beta on the route. I'm not entirely sure if they'd been able to watch men's finals or not, or if this conversation was against the rules or not, but it didn't sit well with Lynn. She didn't think it seemed like the sporting thing to do. And Isabelle went out first and made a great showing, falling off above the high point of all but a few of the men, and the crowd went crazy. Lynn didn't even notice the frenzy. She walked out, tied in, and began climbing in the calm, assertive, never give up way that she always did. And I've searched and searched for footage of Lynn climbing this route with no luck. However, this is the route. We're seeing Ben Moon, Yuji Hirayama, Francois Legrand, and Didier Rabitou all climbing it. So you'll just have to imagine 5'1.5" Lynn Hill up there, battling higher and higher, yarding off of one tiny pocket after another, working through intricate sequences, making big spans over the roof features, and passing the high points of one man after another. Then she passed the move where Isabelle had fallen. And of course, some in the crowd were disappointed to see their hometown girl lose, but most knew that they were watching something special. At the top of the wall, facing a gigantic move off of terrible holds where Robert Cortijo, Ben Moon, Yuji Hirayama, and Simon Naden had all fallen off, Lynn, like all of the male competitors before her, was absolutely perplexed. She climbed up and down, trying everything she could imagine. Retreat, match, shake out, regroup, try again. But the hold remained way out of her reach. Finally, having exhausted all other options, Lynn Hill took a breath, steadied her focus, and jumped. And she stuck it. Now, if Lynn had competed against the men, she'd have gone to the superfinal with Francois Legrand and Didier Rabitou. And who knows? She may have even won. But wait, it gets even more impressive. There's some confusion online about whether this happened in 89 or 90, including a mention on Lynn's website that it was 89, even though she told me via text that it was 1990. And I found the account in a magazine that it was indeed Lyon 1990. However, I went back a little further, and in Rock and Ice number 35, I found something. The reason I didn't see it initially in my research is because this magazine is labeled 1989. But it isn't. That's just a mistake. Same one we all make every year. This is actually from January-February of 1990. And in here, I found this. And remember, this is a year earlier. Editor's note. At Lyon, France, the last World Cup competition of the season, Lynn Hill competed first on the superfinals route, 13B. She nearly completed the course, falling at the last move, when course setters Le Ministrel and Guillot decided to make the course more difficult because they thought the men would flash it. The crowd went wild. The course remained as set. Results after the superfinals: Simon Naden, Jerry Moffatt, Lynn Hill, Gilbert Tribou, Stefan Glovac, and Luisa Giovanni. She didn't just do it once. She did it twice, 2 years in a row in Lyon at a World Cup. Lynn Hill would have been third against the best men in the world, this time beating Gilbert Tribou and Stefan Glovac. So the idea that Janja, unquestionably the greatest competition climber in history, might be able to win against the men, I'd say that it's not only possible, but probable. If you want more stories from climbing history, check out my podcast, Written in Stone, and my new book, looking at the most important ascents from the 1990s, Ben Moon and Hubble, Wolfgang and Action Direct, Lynn and the Nose, Fred Nicole, Josune, and more. And of course, subscribe to the channel. I'll see y'all again soon.